Welcome everyone to our virtual panel discussion on digital technologies and public discourse. My name is Geoffrey Cameron and I'm the Director of Public Affairs for the Baha'i community of Canada. I'm delighted to be hosting this very timely event today, which is co-sponsored by a number of organizations, the Ryerson Leadership Lab, the Mosaic Institute, and the Center for Israel and Jewish Affairs, along with the Baha'i community of Canada. And I want to make a special note to thank Rachel Mansell and the Mosaic Institute for hosting this conversation on their Zoom account. So the purpose of the discussion today is to explore some of the central ethical and political questions of our times. What is the purpose of online discussion platforms in a democratic society? And how should these platforms be designed and regulated in order to serve this purpose? It's increasingly clear that online discussion platforms or social media constitute important aspects of our public sphere. These are places where people deliberate on the issues of the day and where speech has real consequence for our public life. However, these same platforms were not designed to be the public sphere in many cases, nor are they regulated as such. If we consider radio, television, newspapers, these forms of our media and our public sphere are held to much higher standards of public accountability for the speech that they broadcast. We're in the middle of a growing public discussion over what these platforms should be and how they should be managed, both privately and publicly, in what is a rapidly changing and hyper-connected information age. And of course, in Canada, this whole discussion has additional layers. For the most part, we're talking about private companies headquartered outside of our borders. And we're also a country without the same free speech protections as in the United States, and with the track record of protecting people from hate speech and imposing more stringent regulations on our media outlets. So there's a lot to consider here, from philosophical questions about the role of technology in society to practical policy questions that have only become more urgent in recent weeks, as a number of social media platforms have removed thousands of accounts in violation of their terms of service. We're going to be guided in our discussion by 4 experienced and thoughtful individuals. All of these individuals work with organizations that have been actively thinking about and contributing to this topic for some time. And several of them have made submissions to a recent Canadian Commission on Democratic Expression hosted by the Public Policy Forum, from which they might draw on their remarks. So I'll introduce them in the order in which they'll speak. You should be seeing them on your screen. Sam Andrey is the Director of Policy and Research at the Ryerson Leadership Lab at Ryerson University. Dr. Borna Noureddin is a professor at the British Columbia Institute of Technology. Akaash Maharaj is CEO of the Mosaic Institute. And Gayle Nathanson is Associate Director of External Affairs for the Center for Israel and Jewish Affairs. So before we begin, I'll just add a couple of housekeeping notes. Some of you may have participated in this kind of event before, but you'll know that if you have, you'll know this, but if you haven't, just look in your screen and you should see at the bottom of your window, there's a box to contribute questions to the panelists. I'll try to ask as many of these questions as possible after each of them speak for around 7 to 10 minutes. The session is also being recorded and should be made available shortly afterwards. So without further ado, let's get started. I'm going to be turning first to Sam. Sam Andrey, the Ryerson Leadership Lab made a submission to the Canadian Commission on Democratic Expression. I know this is also an area that the Leadership Lab has been working on more broadly, but this submission to the Commission drew on data gathered as part of a survey project the lab was leading. Can you just talk about how Canadians are engaging with social media, and what are some of the implications this has for our democratic life? Furthermore, what kinds of changes to social media platforms should be considered in light of this data?
Yeah, thanks. And thanks, Jeff, for organizing this and putting this on and for having us. And I'm thrilled to get a chance to sort of talk through some of the findings that we found in a survey project that we did with Abacus data right before the last year's federal election in August 2019. And what so I'm just going to pull up the slides, but what we set out to do was to really dig into the questions that you posed to us, which is, how are Canadians engaging on social media? What is driving them apart? How much are they experiencing online harms? And would Canadians support regulatory changes. So we don't have time today to get into everything, but I'm going to give some sort of high level context setting views of Canadians that we gathered. So as I said, 3,000 Canadians back in August 2019, and this project was supported by the governments of Canada and Ontario. So first we asked about the trust in these companies to act in the best interest of the public. To your point, a lot of these companies and platforms were not set up with this purpose in mind. And the results, which you can see on the screen, the red bars are distrust, 1 to 3 on a scale of 1 to 9. You can see of all the companies we asked, and we asked about dozens, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram are the least trusted to act in the public interest. So Canadians are not coming from a trustworthy place when it comes to this. You can see less than telecommunication companies, oil companies, all news media. And I think on the flip side, a more positive note, things like the CBC, La Presse, CTV, Globe and Mail have high levels of trust. And so, how can we increase that level of trust? And what changes are needed, is I think the question that we're talking about today. And then you asked sort of how are people engaging online? And, I think it's fairly common knowledge that it's still a minority of people who are engaging in political and news discourse on social media, that it's not, representative of everyone in the population. But I'm showing 2 slides here just to show that, which is we asked how often do you like a news or a political story on social media? How often do you share it? How often do you comment on it, on that type of story? And you can see there's big gender gaps that skews much more male engagement with political and news discourse on social media. And about 40% of men are doing it at least once a week. And it also skews by political spectrum. On the next slide, both the left and the right, though the right more, are engaging in political discourse, and the people in the center are not, which again, is maybe some evidence of a polarized discourse. So we asked people to place themselves on a left to right scale of 1 to 9 politically, and you can see the results there. So I think, again, just helpful context setting in the way in which our discourse is being driven on these platforms. We then asked people, how often are you seeing harmful things? So we started with deliberately misleading or biased information. And you can see about 40% plus are seeing it at least once a week. Deliberately false information, accidentally misleading or biased information. And then as you go down, you can see that still, upwards of 30-35% of people say at least once a week they're seeing something they consider sexist, racist, hate speech, or violent content. Once a week is pretty often. And you can see the people who say they're never seeing that is quite a small minority. And the other thing is people who are getting their news and political information from social media, Twitter, YouTube, Facebook, see it much more often. And you can see the gray bars are the people who is the overall rates of seeing these things at least once a week. And the different platforms you can see. So people who are on social media to get their information are seeing it much more. And then finally, just the last context setting slide, visible minorities say they're experiencing or seeing hate speech significantly more than non-visible minorities. 50% of visible minorities say they're seeing racist content at least once a week. And 35% say that they've flagged an account or a post for hateful content. So what to do about that all? Because that's, not that encouraging. So we asked people, who do you think is responsible to fix disinformation, hateful speech, and extreme views spreading too easily on social media? So who's responsible? So Canadians have a kind of a mixed views about this. So first, they think the companies are responsible. About a third of people think that. And then a third of people think it's people's faults themselves, that they're responsible. And very few people think it's government's fault. But then we ask, who would you trust to solve the problem? Government goes up to 22%. the amount of people who think people alone can solve it falls back. But still, number one is people want the companies to take the lead and improve the situation, which, as you mentioned, in the past months and weeks, lots has changed on that front. But still, also, 1 in 4 Canadians are not sure. This is a complicated issue, right? So we tried to probe a bit more. So we said, you have to choose between one of these two statements. Protecting freedom of speech at all costs is more important than regulating speech online, or reducing the amount of hate speech, harassment, and disinformation online should be the priority over free speech. So you can see 2 in 3 Canadians side with reducing the amount of hate speech, harassment, and disinformation. But then when we get into, who's responsible, again, people are a mixed bag between the people who are doing the inaccurate or illegal content, and that the social media platforms are responsible. But when we asked, should government intervene to fix these problems, 60% chose yes. But you can see this is, for a government, 60% of the population on your side is not overwhelming, right? Like, this is a complicated issue. People are, I think, rightfully concerned about over-regulating free expression. So then we got into some specific suggestions about how to fix this. And we were actually surprised at the overwhelming popularity. So 80-90+% of Canadians support these things. So requiring platforms to delete accounts that impersonate others, requiring platforms to delete illegal content in a timely manner, requiring platforms to delete accounts that intentionally are spreading disinformation, banning automated content or bot accounts, requiring third-party fact-checking verification of news, and warning users if a post is not yet verified. These are things that are broadly popular and I think, to your point, are not currently regulated by the government. I'm maybe going to skip this, but we did probe a bit. So say the government regulated it and Facebook reacted with beginning to charge Canadians $5 a month, which is about their average Canadian revenue per user from ads. Canadians are not okay with that. Support falls away. If it meant that Facebook shut down altogether, Canadians would not be happy about that either. But if it meant that Facebook had to change the way it operated, if it meant delaying your posts, not allowed to be instantaneous, but instead had to be curated or reviewed first, a majority of Canadians said they felt that was acceptable. So I think I have more to say, and I'm sure we'll get into in the discussion, but I think I showed all that just to say, I think Canadians' views on this are complex. I think they understand and are wrestling with these sort of competing priorities and challenges. But I think there are ways forward that Canadians are ready to embrace. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Sam. And you've both pointed us to, the real sort of elements of the domestic discussion in Canada, and as well as some of the policy choices that I think governments are having to grapple with right now. And I want to go to Dr. Borna Noureddin. Borna, you've been involved as a professor in action research projects focused on the implications of new technologies for our social life. You also consulted with a group of people who helped to prepare the submission from the Baha'i community of Canada to the Canadian Commission on Democratic Expression. I wonder if you could talk about how you see the purpose of social media in the context of a democratic society, and as well as what concepts and principles are relevant to consider when we're looking at these new regulatory frameworks for online platforms.
Sure, thanks, Jeff. And just to echo what Sam said, just gratitude for organizing this space. I have to say, after that presentation, I don't feel I have the credibility to say much, but since I'm here, I'll try to offer a few thoughts. Just to start off with, to acknowledge that where I'm located and mostly work is on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Kwantlen, Musqueam, Katsi, Semiahmoo, Swats, and Pequot and Kwakatlan peoples. So I don't presume to be an expert in, certainly not public policy or anything like that. So what I'll share is just from my own professional and personal experience. I've been an engineer and an educator for the past 25 years or so, including as faculty member at BCIT and in community-based programs for 12 to 18-year-olds. And I felt over the years uneasy about the way that innovation is playing out in general. So I want to come at this at a little bit of a different angle. What Sam shared was really helpful to look at specifically like the current landscape of social media in the context of a democratic society. But let me just say a few words to give some background. And that uneasiness over the years has actually led to some deep questions and a conviction that we might need a different approach to innovation altogether. So let me be clear, I'm a big proponent of technology. I believe Canada is a great country and its future will be technologically sophisticated. I'm just not convinced that that the future will just be an extension of technology and innovation the way we have it today. So I'll say a few things about that, just the background. I'm glad Sam's presentation pointed to corporations, so I'll raise some questions around that too, but again, from a different perspective. And then I might share later on in the discussion some of the results of some action research that's taking place in a lab at BCIT. So just to start off with, I presume that we care about democratic society in so much as it represents an enlightened, just society that's helping to advance civilization. And again, as much as I love Canada, I think we're not quite there yet. We're on a good trajectory, but there's a ways to go. And so if that's true, then any discussion about regulatory frameworks has to be in the context of a society that's constantly evolving and transforming. So I think those regulations then have to be far-sighted. And one possibility, therefore, is to look at the relationship between social media and not just a democratic society, but transformation in a democratic society. Whatever regulation policies we come up with, at the pace of innovation we've been experiencing, within years, if not months, they'll be outdated, irrelevant. So to be farsighted, then in my mind, it's not just looking at Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, this specific digital tool or another, but even thinking of how these technologies came to be. And similarly, it's as important as it is to look at online hate and disinformation on social media. The deeper question is, why is that behavior happening in the first place? And what would be the relationship between digital technologies and what could happen going forward if we were to make the right kind of changes? So I wanted to offer a perspective on that. It's just one very limited perspective. I'm not a historian, but just something I've observed in recent years and then reading kind of accounts of history over the last century. What seems to have emerged is, and it's really picked up after the Second World War, is we've engaged in a cycle where we notice some problem in society, and then we look for technological solutions to them. We innovate, and right at the beginning, as soon as we come up with something, there are people in society that say, hey, wait, this could be some problems with this, but because it seems to be solving some immediate problem for us, we adopt that technology. And at the beginning, it's great. It improves some aspect of social life, and we're very happy. But then over time, and usually by that point, we've adopted the technology wholesale, we begin to see some of the side effects. Now that itself that's fine. One could say that's just part of innovation. The challenge is then, as those other side effects come up, we tend to look at them as problems, and problems that we look to technology again to solve. And I'll give an example of this in a minute. But for after the Second World War, because most of the kind of things we were looking at were kind of technology that had to do, for example, civil engineering, like manufacturing and so on. So it was costly, time consuming. So that cycle would often take years, maybe a decade or more. But with digital technologies, and particularly with social media, where the cost of software development is pretty much bottomed out, related to other kinds of innovations. That cycle, now you can measure it in years, sometimes months. Within a few months, something comes up, some new feature, let's say, on a platform. And again, we can see that it might cause problems, but we adopt it. And by the time those problems emerge, we're all kind of wedded to those platforms. So if that kind of makes some sense, then again, not to be extreme about this, there's no question that social media has had some really positive effects in the kinds of discussions that a democratic society needs. For example, where people are broadly informed and are exposed to different viewpoints. But then when we look closer, there's the question of disinformation. There's the fact that in the end, we may find that it's more of the same segment of society that would normally have a significant voice that also is very active on social media. So it's not clear to me, for example, that it's from a democratic society point of view, it's equally benefited marginalized segments of society who, because of culture, language, race, ethnicity, gender, or a host of other reasons, are still not able to participate in the same way in such discussions. So the reason I mention is because I think regulations would presumably have to understand this dynamic so that all the good things we got with social media are not lost. But aside from the obvious things we're talking about, like online hate and disinformation, the more subtle negative effects of social media are also mitigated. So because Sam mentioned corporations, let me say a couple of words here. It's probably stating the obvious that the design of software and hardware for social media those decisions are made by market forces, and at least partially, often by values held by a very specific profile of a software or hardware developer, and based on their perception of what the world needs or what it wants. And so you might say, well, market forces is fine. That's also representative of the will of the people in a democratic society. But that presumes that all the citizens have equal access, which I don't think they do. If we look at how many people have unlimited data, can stream things endlessly no matter where they are, how many people can replace their devices every year, and yet isn't that the kind of the profile of the person that the big tech companies are basing their design decisions on? And then now, again, this is normal. A corporation's stated purpose is to increase shareholder value. So in other kinds of domains like fuel source technology, transportation, even general entertainment industry, corporations have some sort of regulatory framework or meaningful public policy, but somehow that hasn't happened with digital tools. There's not even any financial incentives for tech companies to operate differently. And so I'm not even talking about, Sam covered the content, but for me, there's questions around even design, software and hardware design. And of course, it makes sense. It's not that the companies are bad or evil. It's just if there are no regulations and their purpose is to increase shareholder value, well, why would we be surprised that their design principles fundamentally are for addiction and distraction? That's a lot of the design principles of social media is based on addiction and distraction, and there's a growing body of literature that's showing this. And I feel this is why we need some sort of regulation and policies that from the part of the government. I'll give you a very simple example. I think it's kind of commonly held that too much screen time is not good for us. In fact, a paper recently out of UBC showed for school-age children, more than 2 hours of screen time actually leads to depression, anxiety, and not a positive outlook on life. So we know too much. It's kind of accepted now, and there's growing evidence that too much screen time is not good for us. And this is an example of what I meant about that cycle earlier. But what's our solution? Apple, please give us screen time. In other words, another app that keeps us on the screen to tell us how much time we're spending on the screen. Or, we're parents and we're concerned about the content on streaming services. And we're looking to those companies to give us parental controls. These are fine, and in fact, what I'm saying is I think the companies are doing what they can, but I don't think that it's enough just to rely on companies to find solutions, especially in the domain of social media, because the design principles actually fundamentally are not what's needed. So, I mean, I might share a few of the things that we've been doing in a lab out of BCIT, but I thought maybe just to say it this way to illustrate kind of the importance of looking at regulatory frameworks that address the things at the level of design. I feel a critical one is to incentivize design away from addiction and distraction. And I'll use an extreme example just to illustrate a point. Imagine that if we said that casinos should teach our students reading and math, we can say, well, after all, they can learn to read by reading the signs, they can count, they can learn arithmetic, they can learn about discrete math and combinatorics, probability, statistics, even psychology by playing the games at the casino. And we could say that since they'll have fun doing it, then they'll have more incentive to learn. And then we could go even further and say to save money, we could just ask the casinos to run our educational programs, or at least provide some services to our existing schools. Now imagine we did this and we lifted all the regulations, tax incentives, and laws from casinos, other than those that apply to a generic corporation. Now I know this is an extreme example, but I wonder if from a certain perspective, what we've done or not done with respect to social media companies at the level of design of digital technologies, I'm not sure it's so different. We know that their design principles are based on addiction and distraction, and yet there's virtually no regulations to stem that tide, to say, no, if we're going to use these tools for educational purposes or for public discussion, it can't be just based on design and distraction. So like I said, I don't have answers to it. I'm not an expert in public policy, but I'm just describing kind of on the ground the kind of challenges that I see play out.
Thanks very much, Borna. I mean, you began your remarks by asking about how we think about innovation. And I think we do often think about innovation as a kind of problem-solving activity that we do as a society, or that a few people do, maybe engineers and business people, but clearly how we think about innovation is much more embedded, or is also embedded in our culture and in the structures of society, which I think we have to keep sight of when we discuss these more discrete concerns around regulation. So thank you. I'm now going to turn to Akaash Maharaj. Akaash, as the CEO of the Mosaic Institute, you lead an organization that aims to promote pluralism. What do you think are some of the challenges that policymakers face when addressing the rise of online hate and disinformation on social media? We've heard from both Sam and Borna that that these features, or these unintended consequences, you could say, of social media affect marginalized communities and people disproportionately. So that's the first question. And then the second is, what do you think is the role of civil society or an organization like Mosaic, or like ours, like the other organizations on this call, in the promotion of common standards that can both protect free speech and promote a healthy public discourse?
Yeah. Well, thank you, Geoffrey. And along with all the other panelists, I should like to thank you, of course, and the Baha'i Association for organizing this event. It is, as we've always said, it's a complicated and important subject, and there's often more heat than light than when we talk about social media. So thank you for convening this. I think that this is a monumentally complex problem for public policy makers to address. And indeed, if one wanted to construct a theoretical example that would tax all of the powers of the state, this would be it. And fundamentally, anyone who's involved in public policy realizes that in a complex and pluralistic society, it's not just possible, but inevitable that equally legitimate perspectives will sometimes conflict. And in those instances, we look to ourselves as members of a free and democratic society, and we look to governments as the agents of democracy to strike the appropriate balance. But that's an especially hard issue here. The regulation of social media lies really at the collision of what I would say are the two most fundamental rights and principles in a free and democratic society. On the one hand, freedom of expression, and on the other hand, the right of citizens to live in dignity and free of fear. Without freedom of expression, I would say that no other rights are possible. But without a life of dignity, no other rights are meaningful. And so what do you happen when these two things collide? First of all, I think that we would all agree that freedom of expression becomes meaningless unless it includes freedom to vex, to outrage, and to offend. The real question is, how far does that go before it starts to intrude on the rights of individual citizens to live in dignity and to live outside of fear? And that is inherently a subjective question. Citizens in Canada would disagree on that. And perhaps even for us on this panel, as people who are accustomed to being in public debate, I would guess that we have a higher tolerance for criticisms, for attack, for uncharitable comments than people who are not involved in public debate in this way. And I think one would also say that people who have not chosen to put themselves in the position of being active participants in the formation of public policy have not sacrificed as much of their right to call on the state to protect their dignity. There's also the question of scale. What makes, in my view, social media different from all the forms of media that have come before is the size of the communications apparatus. Over the course of, if we speak for another hour, let's say, over the course of that hour, there will be 21 million tweets and nearly 2 billion posts on Facebook. It is a monumental scale of communications, and it is entirely impossible for that level of communications to be overseen by human beings. There has to be some form of automated oversight. But there's a mythology, a pernicious and all too prevalent mythology, that when machines do things, it's somehow dispassionate. Machines merely do what we tell them to do. And the question of how those rules are created, what are the values embedded in the rules that are applied by machines, and what are the mechanisms for appeal to actual human beings, those are all inherently political choices. And I would also add, we have to ask ourselves, why does the state regulate some forms of media more rigorously than others? You mentioned television and radio in your introduction, that they are much more strongly regulated than social media. And in part, it's because television and radio are a kind of scarce resource. That is to say, there's only so much bandwidth in traditional television and radio, pre-digital television and radio. And therefore, the state had to make a decision on who has the right to have access to that scarce resource, a scarce resource that belongs to the people. And therefore, there are much more significant choices at play there. If I were to try to think of an analogy of a kind of halfway house between the strong regulation of those kinds of traditional media and the wild west of social media, it might be something like films or plays. Until 1968 in Britain, the Lord Chamberlain censored all plays. You could not put on a play in Britain without the Lord Chamberlain's approval. And until 1968, and the argument for that was that there are only so many theatres and that they therefore constitute a scarce resource. And until 1979, municipal councils censored films. Very famously, The Life of Brian, the Monty Python film, was censored in large parts of the United Kingdom because local municipal authorities would not allow it to be screened. And again, there too, the argument was that there are only so many cinemas. Well, those arguments completely evaporate with social media. There is no limit to the bandwidth of social media. It is possible. Currently, as I said, there are about 2 billion posts per hour on Facebook, and that's only increasing. And there is no practical upper limit. But the case for regulating social media, nevertheless, is not one of scarce resources. It is the fact its power to affect the lives of human beings is proportionately far greater than all those other forms of media. I would, two more things I would say in terms of the challenges facing public policymakers. One is the algorithmic privileging that is embedded in social media. What I mean by that is, if you open up Facebook, for example, and look at your newsfeed, you don't see posts in the order in which they were posted by your friends and colleagues. You see posts in the order that has been chosen by the algorithms of Facebook, and they put at the top of your feed the posts that they most want you to see. They make those decisions based on trying to keep you on the platform. What is it that will most engage you? What is it that will most excite you? And often that is the most pernicious and hateful comment, because it makes people angry or it makes people enthusiastic. It keeps people on the platform. That is a choice. That is as much a political choice as any other. And I would, if one wanted to quantify the effect of that algorithmic privileging, as you may know, recently Facebook culled a large number of its online groups. Of those groups, which Facebook itself has identified as being groups promoting hatred and violence, 60% of the members of those groups said that they became members of those groups because those groups were suggested to them by Facebook's own algorithm. So it's important to bear in mind that these are not value neutral platforms. So from that perspective, the question is, for the state, where does the line exist? What is considered to be acceptable speech or unacceptable speech? And actually, although much of the public debate has focused on that question, it's actually a question that has been well addressed in Canada, going all the way up to the Supreme Court. We actually have very strong laws and very strong precedents about what constitutes speech that incites violence, that promotes that engages in the willful promotion of hatred against identifiable groups, and speech, on the other hand, that is merely distasteful or offensive but must be tolerated in a free and democratic society. The challenge for social media is therefore not the question of deciding what it is that we believe as a society. It is a question of how do we ensure that private actors within these new private actors are obeying the laws and principles that we have already agreed to as a population. And notwithstanding the scale of the post, I don't accept that gives social media companies a free pass. To give you an analogy, if I ran a trucking company and it grew so quickly that I did not have the capacity to perform adequate safety maintenance on my trucks, I could not then turn to the government and say, I'm sorry, I just have so many trucks, I can't fix the brakes. It's up to other members of society and other people on the highways to drive defensively and get the hell out of my way. The government would say, no, if you have grown so quickly that you're not able to keep your activities within the boundaries of the laws that apply to every other citizen in our society, then either you need to find a way to cope with your growth, or you need to stop growing until you have found a way to deal with the inevitable consequences of your activities. The same, I think, applies to social media platforms. The other aspect I would say that does not really apply is we will often hear that social media companies are transnational companies, which obviously they are. That is part core up to their identity and to their power. But that can also foster a mythology that they are somehow above the state, that they are somehow outside the national rule of law. And that's nonsense. There are lots of activities that are carried out internationally. They are all subject to the domestic rule of law. And indeed, if one were to go to look at a Twitter feed in, for example, or a Facebook feed in Thailand versus a Facebook feed in Canada, it would look different because Facebook is abiding by the laws that are set out in Thailand. Now, I have to say those laws are highly authoritarian, and I would not wish to see them imported into Canada. But that fact gives the lie to any kind of claim that they cannot regulate themselves nationally because they are somehow exceptional. There's nothing exceptional about global business. It's been going on for centuries. The ability of technology companies to try to claim that their cross-border activity liberates them from national democratic oversight is somewhat novel. and the fact that it has been successful is extraordinary to me. The last part I would say is that government, in trying to regulate social media, should be paying attention not only to what kind of posts are allowed on those platforms and whether they violate national laws and national norms, but they also have an interest in monitoring and regulating the algorithms that determine what is privileged. Now, there are legitimate concerns about companies not wishing to reveal trade secrets and actually make explicit their algorithms, and I can understand that. But there is no good argument against the outcomes of those algorithms being audited. So if we don't need to know what the algorithms used by Facebook are, but if we do know that those algorithms are surfacing and rising to the top content that violates Canadian law, then there should be legal liability for Facebook and those platforms. It's not up to us to tell them how their algorithms should be constructed, but it is up to us to say that there are certain outcomes for their algorithms that are not acceptable in a free and democratic society. Finally, on your second question about what is the role of civil society, I think part of it is in making the case and establishing the social license for governments to regulate social media. Ultimately, it is up to the population to decide what it thinks is acceptable and what it thinks is unacceptable. Governments cannot lead where the people will not follow. So it really is important for civil society organizations like ours to say there is a case, not for, I wouldn't even say for exceptional regulation of social media, but there's certainly a social case that is broadly supported by the population, that the rules that apply to the many should also apply to the few. The rules that apply to people to ordinary people who print material should also apply to multinational corporations that broadcast it on social media. The second aspect is in the setting of standards through consultations with populations across the country, especially vulnerable populations. One of the key criteria for determining what is acceptable and unacceptable in our society is whether it causes harm. And I think that there's a rule for civil society organizations to provide analysis and to provide advice that there are certain kinds of expression that are actually inciting hatred, are actually causing real world harm. Also, I would say that there is, but stepping back from the role of the government, I think that there's a deeper and perhaps more important role for civil society organizations in addressing the origin of hate speech. Social media platforms have to bear responsibility for the extent to which they catalyze hatred, for the extent to which they promote it as a business tool to build engagement. But we cannot pretend as Canadians that they have invented hatred. There are wells of hatred within our own country, and we have to understand this as a society, where that is coming from, why it's happening, and how we as a population can try to break the very unhealthy cycles that causes otherwise ordinary people to fall down a well of hatred. Facebook and Twitter may accelerate the speed with which they fall down that well, but they did not create the social circumstances that give rise to hatred. And there is a strong case for us as a society to take a stronger hand, firstly, in providing counter narratives. I think that one of the greatest replies to hate speech is speech that is not hateful. It is organizations and people who slay lies with the truth. But equally, I think that we think of phrases like radicalization applying to people in other countries, applying to terrorist organizations. That also applies to Canadians, and there are many forms of radicalizations. Hatred is a form of radicalization, and the tools that we use to de-radicalize people who are engaged in violent activities in far-off lands are the very same tools that we should be applying to our own society to de-radicalize people who fall victim to the siren song of hatred. The last thing I would say that for a role of civil society organizations is to provide public oversight over the actions of state authorities who regulate social media. We've been speaking a lot, I suspect we will continue to speak more about the responsibility of public institutions to regulate social media. But we cannot ignore that that too represents a tremendous amount of power. And that power is just as susceptible to abuse by political actors and just as susceptible to creating social evils as the absence of the use of that power. I mentioned Thailand earlier. Very recently, within the past few weeks, there was a woman who was sentenced to 43 years in prison for criticizing the king of Thailand. Now, I'm sure that people in the audience to this webinar are going to be rolling their eyes and shaking their heads and saying, well, that could never happen in Canada. I put it to you that our neighbors south of the border have just had a 4-year object lesson in what happens when societies say that could never happen here. The state is the sword of the people, but civil society is the shield of the people. And that is one of our most important roles, is protecting the population from the abuse of the very tools that we think are important to serve us.
Thanks very much, Akaash. I mean, in where your remarks ended, you've created a nice bridge to our next speaker, but I just want to recognize, I mean, you began by saying that these are very complex issues, but I thought you actually simplified a number of them considerably by puncturing a few of the myths that I think exist out there about the challenges of, especially of regulating some of these companies, that when we place these new technologies in comparison to old ones, we can see that many of the reasons we consider for failing to act are actually not good reasons at all. And that these are value-based decisions, as you said. These are not value-neutral platforms, and there are political choices that a democratic society has to make about the kind of public sphere we want. So thank you very much for that. Now moving on to our next speaker, who is, I think, going to extend some of the themes that Akaash addressed. Gayle Nathanson, you work with the Center for Israel and Jewish Affairs, which has been at the leading edge of advocacy for policy measures that can limit the spread of online hate. So on this subject in particular, I wondered how you think the Canadian government and as well as Canadian civil society can make a difference in how these major platforms operate on the issue of hate. And I wanted to ask also what new issues you see on the horizon, especially in the context of COVID-19.
Thank you, Jeff. And like everyone else said, thank you for including us today. It's been really interesting for me to listen to the panelists before me because the perspectives you bring are quite different from where we're coming from at CEJA and a lot of the other communities that we work with. So CEJA, for those of you who don't know, is the advocacy agent for the Jewish federations across Canada. We work on a whole range of public policy issues. One of the primary issues we work on is the fight against racism, discrimination, and hate in general. And lately, a lot of that work has revolved around online hate. As a Jewish organization, we focus specifically, or our lens comes from the perspective of anti-Semitism, but we're concerned about all forms of hate and discrimination and racism, online and offline. Online hate is awful in and of itself. It causes significant trauma for those targeted. And again, that's the perspective that we're bringing to this discussion, which is that of a targeted community. Even if someone's not physically assaulted, to be targeted by online hate, whether as an individual or as part of a community, is a violation. And it leads to people wanting to hide who they are for fear of being targeted, which is one of the worst outcomes of hate mongering, is that people are scared to identify with their religion, with their race, with their gender identity, whatever it is. But we also know, and we've seen examples of online hate also leading to real world violence. We saw that in Washington a couple of weeks ago, which really makes it terrifying and brings it even more to the forefront. And I think it's a reason that people are paying extra attention to it lately. As I said, we pay obviously specific attention to anti-Semitism because that's the community we represent, but we are just as concerned and horrified by all forms of hatred and how it's spread. Hate targeting individuals or groups based on their religion, race, gender, sexual orientation, ability, none of this is new. Anti-Semitism, anti-Black racism, hate targeting Muslims, Sikhs, the LGBTQ community, it goes on, and none of it is new. But the internet and online communications have brought the problem of hate, racism, and discrimination to a whole new level. And touching a little bit on what Akaash just mentioned, it used to be that in order to spew hate, one needed to say it out loud, in person, face to face, maybe a few feet apart. And you had to have the guts to face your target, the person that you were directing your hate towards. Sometimes you could reach a broader audience through more traditional media, printed publications or otherwise, but you had to find somebody willing to print your point of view or not edit you out of the conversation on the cutting room floor before you went to air. Of course, all that's changed now. And the advent of the internet, instantaneous communication, social media, at the press of a button or buttons, has been a game changer for haters. Safely tucked behind the veil of their computer screens, hate mongers have been able to spread their messages in an instant, targeting not only an individual, a group, or a community, but really anyone who will listen. So it's essentially a recruiting tool as well as a form to spew hatred. And we all know it multiplies. The reach is so vast that people have never thought this way before, have never had these hateful thoughts, or it hasn't occurred to them to target a particular community in a particular way, can be indoctrinated by somebody that they've never met, never seen, never spoken to, don't even know who they are. And they can be indoctrinated to hate someone or a whole community of people that they've never met or never seen, and they don't know who they are. So the hate may not be new, but the breadth and the speed with which it travels certainly is. And as we know, and this goes to a point that Jeff just raised, the problem of online hate has grown even worse over the past 10 months during the pandemic. The first time I mentioned this, it was like 2 months, then it was 3 months, and now I'm still saying however many months of the pandemic, but here we are. We all know that people are forced apart by COVID. Our primary way of connecting with our family, our friends, our colleagues has been online. And these online connections have been our sustenance through all this compulsory physical distancing. But this enhanced virtual life has also provided a golden opportunity for haters to spread their vitriol at lightning speed to a broader audience, targeting a wider range of victims than ever before. Vulnerable people, often isolated in their homes, are subjected to Zoom bombing and other forms of virtual attack as they join religious services, family gatherings, informational webinars, or group meetings. And no form of online gathering has been spared the torment of online hate. I'm sure many of you have experienced this firsthand, maybe at a gathering of your religious community, maybe in a meeting like this. And many communities that have been subjected to systemic discrimination, persecution, and genocide continue to face repeated incidents of hate speech and denial, adding insult to injury and depriving them of the closure they deserve. So the impact of online hate is devastating in and of itself, but it can also lead to real-world violence. We've seen attacks against Jews, against Muslims, against women, you name it. We've seen all sorts of physical, real-world violence targeting groups that started off in online communities. So to the initial question, what can we as civil society groups and individuals do about it? We can pay attention, we can work together, and we can seek action. And this is what CEJA does. We have to pay attention. So dissemination of false and hateful information cheapens our public discourse, undermines our democracy, and endangers our most vulnerable people. We've seen this disintegration or breakdown of public discourse escalate over the past 10 months during the pandemic. For example, our community, Jews, have been accused of all sorts of conspiracies during the pandemic, from creating COVID-19 to profiting from the pandemic, to claiming that Israel has leveraged the pandemic to oppress Palestinians by denying them the vaccine. And we've all watched with horror the consequences of the widely spread falsehood of a stolen election, and we saw that reach the steps of the U.S. Capitol. To Akaash's point, something I don't think any of us ever would have imagined happening not so long ago, maybe not even a few months ago. So all of us have a role to play in stopping the spread of disinformation, misinformation, and particularly hate. We can do this by thinking critically before spreading dubious information. That's one thing we can do. And CEJA, together with funding support from Canada's Department of Heritage, has produced an informational website and campaign called Stop the Transmission, which provides extensive tools and resources to confront the challenges of disinformation, foster critical thinking, and help all of us be what we would call better digital citizens. So I would encourage all of you, I can try to share my screen for a minute to show you the campaign. You can find it at stopthetransmission.ca. And it actually has a list of things you can do to become more aware of the spread of disinformation, how to identify it, and what to do about it. So I'll just, if I can, let's see if I know how to do this. Share. So just briefly, you can see what the page looks like, and there's a list of resources, and there's various tools to share, to teach you about identifying disinformation, misinformation, and what to do about it. Okay, so that's one thing we can do. We also need to work together, and together we need to seek change. And this is another area that CJ's been very active in over the past number of months, and that I am honored to be part of. We have banded together with a broad range of civil society, faith-based, and other groups equally concerned about the issue of online hate to form the Canadian Coalition to End Online Hate. And together we've called on the government to move forward with a national strategy to combat online hate. Many of you have participated in our coalition or in the various consultations that have been going on with government. It's a very live issue right now. And we've asked as a coalition and as CJA for a number of particular policy changes to address this issue. One is to increase resources for law enforcement, crowns, and judges to ensure that they actually receive sufficient training on how to apply existing laws to deal with online hate. As we talked about before, I think Akaash mentioned it, Jeff mentioned it, and a number of you mentioned it. We have laws on the books to deal with hate speech, and we need to ensure that the participants in the criminal justice system understand those laws, are thoroughly familiar with different forms of hate. We do a lot of work around training around anti-Semitism and what that can look like, and a lot of other communities are doing the same with respect to their particular forms of hate. We also think it's really important to address the gap in data collection to help us determine the scope of the problem of online hate and to monitor any progress we're making, hopefully, towards addressing it. A point that all of you have spoken to that is fundamental in addressing the issue of online hate is to ensure that we achieve a balance between combating online hate while at the same time protecting freedom of expression. And we think it's important to look at formulating a definition of hate and hatred that is consistent with the Supreme Court of Canada jurisprudence. We're also looking at some kind of a civil remedy to address online hate to complement the criminal justice system, which we know is a rather blunt tool, and rightly so, is actually very difficult to access and prosecute a case under the hate speech provisions. And finally, and what a lot of you have been speaking about today, is establishing strong and clear regulations for online platforms and internet service providers on how they monitor and transparently address incidents of hate spreading on their platforms. And on that note, we've been doing a little more thinking around that. And we think that a few elements that are key to those kinds of regulations are including a mandatory directive that providers incorporate appropriate definitions of hate and hatred in their user code of conduct, their algorithms, to Akaash's points, their moderator policies, and the terms of service. So all these platforms and providers have terms of service and agreements with their users. We all click that I agree box without reading any of the 400 preceding pages. But we're calling on them to include some of this information, some of these requirements in their user policies, and then to actually enforce those policies. It can be a really strong tool to use if they choose to use it. We also believe that providers have to make it easier for users to flag hateful content. The users have to understand how to do that and have to be encouraged to do so. And it's our position that we need an independent regulator to address this industry. To point made, I think, by each of my speakers prior to me, there's regulators in place for the more traditional forms of media. We need to look at how, and that's not necessarily the right regulator for this new form of media. So we need to look at what that looks like. So just to wrap up and to go back to the opening question, what is the purpose of online platforms and how can they improve our public discourse? look, obviously, this whole conversation has been about sort of the bad that happens through online platforms. Obviously, there's an immense amount of good that's come from the ability for people to connect to one another, to access information that they didn't have access to before, to educate one another, to be educated, to inform one another, to organize, to connect. But providers and platforms and the rest of us as users of these providers and platforms have to take responsibility to ensure that this does not become a tool to spread hate and to incite violence. To improve public discourse, we all must take some responsibility to call out hate, to call out disinformation, and to call out misinformation when we see it. We have to not share it, we have to take it down, and we have to act. And that's what I have to say.
Thank you very much, Gayle, and thanks to all of our speakers for such, I think, thoughtful and complimentary sets of remarks. I mean, I think we began with an examination of survey data and an interpretation of that data and what some of its implications might be from Sam. Borna brought us into a deeper reflection on the role that culture and structure play in the process of innovation and how we deal with unintended consequences of new technology. Akaash continued sort of a discussion about the role of values in technology, and Gayle has kind of brought us into this very concrete and pressing issue of hate and how we deal with the problem of online hate. So now I know that there are a number of questions that have come in, but I'm just going to take the chair's prerogative and ask the first one, as I remind all of you to please add any questions you might have into the Q&A box, and I'll try to ask a few of them before our time is up. I just wanted to begin, we did talk, as Gayle mentioned, quite a lot about the bad or the negative aspects of social media and how regulation might sort of get at curbing the negative uses of social media. Borna also mentioned the role of design as well. However, if we look at what the government of Canada has done, a significant amount of funding has been invested in digital literacy initiatives as one way to get at this problem. So I wonder if I could ask you, and this is a question maybe for any of the panelists, what do you think are both the possibilities or promises of digital literacy initiatives, and what are their limits maybe in terms of how to think about this problem? And when I talk about digital literacy, maybe we can just think of this broadly as efforts to raise consciousness, especially maybe among young people, but among others as well, about how to use and navigate these social media platforms. So it's going to be first to raise their hand or unmute their microphone, I think. Or else I'm going to start calling on you. Akaash, please.
Oh, I struggle with what I'm about to say because I'm going to break the first rule of the internet, and that is never bring up the Nazis. But I am going to bring up the Nazis. I think that there is, believe it or not, a hopeful analogy here, and that is if anyone in the audience here has ever watched the Nazi propaganda film Triumph of the Will, I actually recommend it highly, not for the propaganda, but to get a sense of how that manipulated such a large number of people. And one of the reasons, as I look at it in its historical context, of why that was such a tremendously effective tool for manifest evil and was able to recruit so many people to the cause, is in part because it was a new technology. Most people who were alive in Germany, most people alive in the world at that time, had never been in an airplane. So, for example, seeing a film that starts in an airplane descending from the clouds, that to us would seem unremarkable. It's difficult for us to put ourselves in the shoes of people who experienced that for the first time and were swept away by it. Today, I know that film would not have the sort of impact on the public that it had in the 1930s. And perhaps we are looking at the same thing with social media. That is, the power of social media is in part a function of the fact that for a large percentage of the population, it is a new experience. And as we mature as a society, as people become more accustomed to social media, as they start viewing things hopefully with a more skeptical lens, perhaps that will abate the ability of social media to drive exactly the sorts of behaviors the Triumph of the Will drove in the 1930s. But we can't we can't hope that that happens on its own, because the ill that can be caused by social media is too great. So I think that public education is tremendously important in getting people to step back, to question what they are looking at, to think critically about, to exercise the oldest forms of critical thinking, but for new media, and to ask themselves, who is telling me this? Should I believe it? Am I being manipulated by this? And am I following a trail of breadcrumbs down a path to a very dark place that I would never have gone had I known what the destination was? In many ways, this is an old story in a new context, but that should be something that gives us hope. I do also want to say, in response to your point, Jeff, as much as we are talking about the need to regulate social media, I actually think social media is tremendously positive. It has enabled human beings across the world to join hands. It has enabled people who are parts of small minority communities who have felt very alone to find friends and to realize that they are not alone. It has enabled oppressed populations to rise up against their oppressors and subvert the forms of authoritarian censorship and oppression that have always been the stock and trade of dictatorships. But like so many things, the power to do good also implies the power to do ill. And I think that public regulators have not caught up to that fast enough, which is the reason why we are having this conversation now.
Thanks, Gayle. I see your hand up.
Yep, I'm having trouble with my mute button. So I just wanted to pick up on what Akaash said, because I'm in total agreement. We're in total agreement, and that Stop the Transmission campaign is a lot exactly about that, Akaash, where I think that we just need to teach people that before they click on like or share, and while they're reading their tweet or whatever they're about to share, while they're also doing 6 other things at the same time, like we're all doing, especially today when we're all in front of screens all day, that they think about it. Just because they think the picture's cute doesn't mean you want to share it right away until you think about where is it coming. Maybe you scroll down a bit and see what some of the comments are associated with what it is you're about to share. And just to teach people to start doing that. I think so many of us started using these tools at first to connect with our friends and, you know, family and our camp friends that we haven't seen in 25 years, or somebody we, you know, knew in 3rd grade, that we just got used to just accepting what was coming along and sharing it. But it's sort of like those evil chain letters, or those, you know, like the viruses that can spread if you click on the link through your email. We had to all be taught, don't click on something if it looks like it's a little bit questionable. You have to read through and look at the address that it's coming from, and just spend 30 seconds to think about whether this is something that is reliable and true, and whether it's something that you know, that stands for what you believe in and want to share. And the only other thing I would say is what's happened in the past few weeks in the United States, sort of leading up to, and then sort of, I don't want to say ending with, but exploding in the storming of the Capitol, I think for some people was a bit of an awakening to see what can happen when people keep clicking on and sharing this idea of, oh, maybe the election was stolen from us. Maybe it was fraudulent. People who didn't even necessarily think twice about it or believe it just thought, I think it was Akaash's point, you know, it was the top of their feed and they thought it was an interesting story. But look, you know, that's how they ended up with thousands of people marching in Washington and feeling like it was okay to storm the Capitol. So I am hopeful that that is an example that everyone around the world witnessed, that we can use to continue to help educate people to think twice before they automatically accept what's come across their phone or their computer.
I'll just maybe hum a couple bars on this, and I just want to say this panel is so great. I love panels when I'm learning from everybody. I'm a bit down on digital literacy myself. It's not that I don't think it's important. I think for all the reasons that just said, and I think, you know, it has to start in grade school. There's already like media literacy in grade school, and, you know, in many ways our societal norms around anti-racism discrimination are shaped by the school system, and of course we need to continue to do that through to modernize with social media. But the reason I say I'm down on it is I think the tools are changing so fast that I think it's a fool's errand to think that we can keep the population, apprised on the latest ways. Like in the last 3 months, they started tagging Trump's tweets. Fleets were invented. Like the way that they curated the news around the election changed. And so, like, if we'd done a great job, a year ago, and everybody across Canada had received great digital literacy training, it would now be fundamentally different. Because what do I make of these labels and tags? And so I guess I just say all that to say, and I think it's to Akaash's point about scale of these things. And I just looked, the 8 most valuable companies in the world, 6 are technology companies that are responsible for these platforms. They have the resources to curate and moderate. And there's a line that Joan Donovan from Harvard, who's an expert in disinformation, says a lot that I love, which is amplification requires curation, which is, yes, there's millions and billions of these posts, but most of them are, I love your dog and recipe sharing. And, but if things are scaling, then like all media, like radio, television, that is scaling to a big audience, I think it requires a different form of moderation. And so I think I just say all that to say, yes, digital literacy is important, but there are real limits to what it can achieve.
Thanks, Sam. Maybe just continuing on this point about digital literacy and to connect it to a couple of the questions that have come in. Some of these questions I think have been addressed with earlier remarks, but maybe I can tie a couple together and present them to Borna to open as a beautiful present that he'll present to us. So there's a question here about technological choice, how organizations make choices about technology. And there's also a question about how local communities take ownership over the use of social media in this way. So I think we do often think about digital literacy as maybe something that happens in the schools and is directed towards children. I mean, I have a young daughter and I know that she's receiving a form of digital literacy education in schools. But then we also can think about organizations and groups as making informed choices about the technologies and platforms that they use. So, Borna, what do you think are the possibilities and limits of digital literacy, maybe at those levels as well? And if you want to expand to address other aspects of those questions, please do.
Sure, thanks. No, I was thinking when you first asked about the question of digital literacy, how, literacy, if we want to use that word, is often associated with agency. And I think if we look at it that way, so maybe we're thinking of digital literacy in terms of protection, but maybe one way to expand it is to say part of protecting yourself is actually being well informed, and so that, but then in the process, it's not just about protecting yourself, it's actually having agency, being able to decide, for example, what to use, how to use the tools, and so on. So I thought maybe I'll share a few things that from a couple of small efforts that the lab out of BCIT that we have has found just over the last year or so. There's a few graduate students carrying out some action research. First, to start off, if we think of digital literacy as simply giving out facts, information, skills, it won't go far enough. That's kind of our observation. You have to address things that you have to think about your attitudes, habits, especially what kind of habits do we have? Habits of using, but also habits of thought as well. And so, like any other literacy effort, you have to take into account kind of the social, cultural, sometimes even political context, even at a local level. So maybe I'll just describe a couple of efforts. So one is in partnership with the Edmonds Community School in Burnaby, British Columbia. We started with a group of grade 6 and 7 girls last year. And it just started out of some conversations with them, just to start to understand how do they use social media, because we were becoming aware through other educational programs that that the use of smartphones and social media was somehow interfering, that we were starting to see reports come out of increased instances of anxiety and depression and so on. So we wanted to understand. So the first question, it was just very informal, just talking to them about, how do they use their device, and immediately they articulated the first session that, yeah, we know that using social media and being too much on video games and things is causing anxiety and depression. And they very openly admitted that many of their friends struggle with this. So, just telling them don't do this isn't going to change anything. So we started to understand a little bit better why. And then it led to a short survey that we're just preparing for a publication about. But the upshot was this. There was one conversation I remember talking to them, and I asked them, because they're using phones, what we call smartphones. So I said, when was that last time you used that thing to call your friends? And he said, well, we call each other all the time. And I said, no, when was the time you actually dialed a number? And they looked at me puzzled, like, why would we dial a number to call our friends? Because calling they do through the social media platforms, right? So then I said, well, if you never use the dial feature, why do you have this expensive device that is actually, we call it a phone, which is used for calling people? And so they paused, and they were really puzzled, but even by the question. But you see, like, first of all, it was already an example. There's all these things that the device is designed for. That's not what they want to use it for. But it comes with features that they want to use. So then we got into a discussion of, okay, well, with Instagram and social media, what do you use it for? The survey had shown what kind of apps do they use, and so on. And a lot of it was, especially for the girls, but even for the boys, a lot of it was to spend time with friends. That's what they wanted to do. So even to the point of like using it it's not just the adults, like for young people, that's the biggest, there's a reason it's called social media. It's their social circle, right? So I asked them, I said, well, why do you spend so much time on the screen? You guys go to the same school. Your friends aren't somewhere else in the world. Why don't you just hang out with each other? And then one of them said, well, I'm not allowed to go out and be with my friends. This is the only way I can stay in touch. So I thought about it, and I asked them, I decided to be a little provocative. I said, okay, I'll make you a deal. If I were to say, if I talk to your parents and they said that if you do all of your homework and chores and everything, you're allowed to go out and spend as much time with your friends as you want. In exchange, I'm going to take your device away from you. Would you go for this deal? And at first they were like, oh, no. And then they thought about it and they said, yeah, actually, if my parents said that, I would do it. So what that told me is it's not that they actually, like, when they really think about it, it's not so much that they need to use these tools, they want to use these tools. There's something happening in the community. There's a structure of community life where it's not so acceptable anymore to go and just play on the street or be each other's house until supper time. That kind of culture that I know I grew up with is not there anymore. And so they're getting mixed messages. Their parents are saying, no, don't go out. We want you to be with your friend, but don't spend so much time using your devices. And meanwhile, the parents themselves are using their devices. And then to make matters worse, they go to school, and in the school, the teachers are saying, hey, use social media, use the internet to look this up, and we'll give you Wi-Fi. And then we tell them, why are you up until 2 a.m. playing Fortnite and then come to school tired? Well, we've kind of created these conditions. The school, by giving Wi-Fi, the way they're using the devices, the example the parents are setting. So we shared some of this at a PAC meeting, and the parents themselves, it was eye-opening. So I mentioned this one example because if we're going to do digital literacy, and it was an example of how you have to engage, if we want agency, it's not just a question of telling a young person, do this, don't do that, use it this way, be mindful. We have to create conditions, we have to create environments at the home, in the life of the community. The local institutions like schools, community centers, libraries, I think have to be much more thoughtful in how they encourage the use of social media. And again, not just saying how not to use it, but what are the healthy patterns, and then to set things up in a way that makes it easier, not harder, to have the right habits with respect to social media. So I kind of agree with Sam. I'm not a big fan of digital literacy in the way it's conceived because I feel it's too superficial. But I think if a digital literacy program really goes at education that engages the individual, their community, as well as local institutions of society, I think that kind of digital literacy program is sorely needed, in fact, but it just will take some time to map out exactly what it will look like.
Thanks, Borna. Gayle, I think I'm going to give you the last word.
Oh,
then I'm going to wrap it up.
Okay, well, I just wanted to riff a little bit on this discussion
Please.
around literacy, because when I heard both what Sam and Borna said, it occurred to me that this is a term we throw around a lot, but maybe that's not the right term, because I take what Sam has said and Borna said. I don't think it's about the digital part. It's more about the literacy part. It's about being a critical thinker. It's about reminding people that just because we're being inundated with a lot more information, which actually causes us to have less time to think, I think. You know, we're reacting. We're always reacting. We're not, we often don't have the time to think about things. I think it's really just about the fact that it's digital is irrelevant. You know, we should be doing the same thing when we read the newspaper, or we get a flyer, or we get something dropped off on our front door, which doesn't happen so much anymore. But it's more about the literacy, the critical thinking, the taking the time to ask yourself where this information is coming from, the same way you would if somebody whispered you a rumor in the schoolyard. You think about who's it coming from and what's the credibility and what happens if I tell somebody else this thing. It's the same thing. So I think I totally take your point. I mean, I am so digitally illiterate. I would be the last person to be in a position to teach someone about that. But I think it's really important, whether we start with our kids and our neighbors and our friends, or whoever we're connecting with online, that we remind them that you still have to think critically. Just because you're getting inundated with information doesn't give us an excuse to not take the time to think about whether this piece of information is worthy of the screen it's on or of passing on. So.
Well, that's a great note to end on. Thank you so much, Gayle. I promised at the beginning of this panel that we would be getting into both the deep philosophical questions as well as the more technical policy ones. And I think we have covered quite a bit of ground. I think also just illustrating how these questions are not ones for technical experts alone. They're really ones that deserve widespread deliberation and that should be engaging all of us, from parents and teachers all the way up to those who are working at the level of design and engineering. And so, I mean, if those of you who are attending and this has triggered your interest, I hope you'll search for some of the work that each of the organizations sponsoring this event have done on this issue. Once again, I just want to recognize and thank the Ryerson Leadership Lab, the Mosaic Institute, the Center for Israel and Jewish Affairs, as well as my own organization, the Baha'i Community of Canada, for putting on this event. And again, a special thank you to Rachel Mansell for the support she provided to host the Zoom webinar today. So thanks to our speakers, and have a good rest of the day, everybody.